Hey friends! Welcome back to the Animal Nerd Podcast. I'm your host, an actual cryptid, and I am so happy that you are here. Today I'm going to share with you the story of an animal who's actually still alive, which is surprisingly rare for the show. This is the story of Wisdom the albatross, the world's oldest wild bird. And although this isn't one of my historical episodes, in order to tell this story, I do need to take you back in time to begin with. Specifically, I need to take you back to 1956, to a tiny collection of islands in the North Pacific Ocean called Midway Atoll. Halfway between North America and Asia, Midway is part of the Hawaiian archipelago, and at this point in time was being used mainly as a US military base. But despite that, it was still home to a large population of seabirds, including albatrosses, and on this particular day in 1956, a group of scientists were carrying out conservation work, putting identification bands on the legs of some of these birds, each with a specific tag so that they could be individually identified, to allow them to get a better understanding of the lives of these albatrosses, which was broadly a mystery as they spent so much of their lives out at sea, often coming onto land only once a year to breed. As ever, when it comes to helping animals, knowledge was the key. The more they knew about the migration patterns and lifespan of these birds, the more that could be done to protect them. It had already been 20 years since scientists first started banding albatrosses on Midway Atoll in 1936, and in this particular year alone, 8,400 birds were given leg bands. Some had their old ones replaced, as they will otherwise eventually corrode and fall off, while others had bands put on for the first time. One of these first-timers was a female laysan albatross, a species known to Hawaiians as moli, and to nerds as Phoebastria immutabilis. She was given a band marked Z333 by biologist Chandler Robbins, an incredible biologist and ornithologist who dedicated his life to helping protect and preserve wild birds. And this bird, who would now be known as Z333 in the meticulous records kept by the scientists, didn't stand out to Robbins. As I said, there were almost 8,500 birds that were banded that year alone, and across the course of his career, Robbins would band over 190,000 individual birds from over 300 different species, a large percentage of which were albatrosses. So this female didn't really stand out as anything special, she was just one of many. He estimated her age to be about 5 years old. She had an egg that year, so she would have had to have been at least 4 since albatrosses never breed before that age, but she could have been older. Some albatrosses don't lay eggs until they're 8 or 9 years old. That's because albatrosses mate for life, and, very sensibly, they don't want to rush into finding their life partner. Albatrosses will come to land and seek a mate when they're about 4 years old, almost all of them returning to the same nesting site where they themselves were hatched, despite having spent pretty much all their life out at sea since fledging all those years ago. And even if they do find a mate pretty quickly, it takes them a while to decide whether or not this one really is the one, a decision they come to through a series of elaborate ritual dances. Forging a lifelong bond takes time, and their courtship can take years, hence why most albatrosses don't start breeding as soon as they turn 4, although some certainly do. I guess those ones just hit it off really well with their mates. Or maybe they're just impulsive, I don't know. As I said, Z333 didn't stand out as anything particularly special, but you've probably guessed by now that Z333 is indeed the albatross who had come to be known as Wisdom, and clearly she became something special given that I've managed to create an entire podcast episode about her. So how did that come about? Well, to find that out, we need to fast forward 46 years. It's now 2002, and once again, scientists are tagging birds at Midway Atoll. And a lot has changed since the 50s. For a start, Midway is no longer anything to do with the military. It's now known as Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, and is a protected area under the care of the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and is a part of, and I'm going to do my best with this, Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. The 3 islands that make up the atoll, Sand Island, Eastern Island and Spit Island, are home to almost 3 million birds belonging to 20 or so different species, all of whom nest there each year, including the world's largest population of albatrosses, as well as plenty of other species, some of whom are endangered, and all of whom rely on the atoll for their survival. Midway is surrounded by a stunning coral reef, which also provides an important habitat for green sea turtles, spinner dolphins and Hawaiian monk seals. The atoll is an important place for indigenous Hawaiians, in whose language it's known as Pehemanu, which literally means the loud din of birds, a very appropriate name. It's a place of great spiritual significance, and albatrosses are seen as the body form of the god Lono. Albatrosses return to the atoll every year in October and November, the same time of year as the Makahiki season, the traditional Hawaiian New Year festival in honour of Lono. But let's go back to the story. It's 2002, and as is the case every year, scientists and conservationists are there banding birds to monitor their population. And one of these scientists is, once again, Chandler Robbins. And when he catches one particular bird and checks its band, I imagine he had to do a double take. Because when checking this against their records, it becomes clear that this bird is Z333, the very same albatross he tagged 46 years ago. She hasn't been recorded since then, but clearly she's been thriving. And given that she was estimated to be 5 years old, that means she's now at least 50 years old, maybe older. And this is a massive deal, because at this time it was believed that the natural lifespan for laysan albatrosses was only about 40 years, and yet here's this girl at least a decade older than that, perfectly healthy and raising an egg. She didn't seem elderly or infirm at all. She appeared to be in her prime, and yet just by being there and breeding, she was rewriting everything scientists knew about her species. And the fact that it was once again Chandler who caught her, the first time she'd been found since he tagged her, is just such a lovely coincidence. I don't know when Wisdom was given her name, but I would imagine it was around this time, since this is obviously when she first began to stand out. Of the 3 million or so birds on the atoll, about a third of whom are laysan albatrosses, Wisdom is one of the only ones to have a name, which I thought was interesting, but apparently it's just me because in all my research I couldn't find when she got the name, who gave it to her, anything like that. But I mean, regardless, I'm going to start calling her Wisdom now because frankly, it's easier to say than Z333. Albatrosses like Wisdom are hard to track because they spend up to 90% of their lives out on the open ocean, never touching land, taking micro-naps as they fly, and feasting on squid, fish, and whatever other small aquatic creatures they can catch. The only time an adult albatross will return to land is for the mating season, when they meet up with their lifelong mate and perform a courtship dance with them to renew their lifelong bond, and go about the process of setting up their nest ready for eggs. However, even once they're fully grown and have a mate, laysan albatrosses don't breed every single year. Most of them will have a year or two off every now and then because raising their young is pretty intensive. They only lay one egg per breeding season, and if something happens to it, then they won't lay another until at least the next year, and typically the process of incubating their egg and raising their chick takes about 7 months in total, which is a long time to invest in a single chick and a long time to spend away from the sea. Of course, they're not completely earthbound in this time. The parents take it in turns to fly out to the ocean to find food, but even so, it's a lot of work, and the parents need to be absolutely sure that they're able to take on that burden before they breed. And some years they just don't feel up to it. Honestly, it's just surprisingly responsible parenting for a bird. Wisdom, though, seems to be a pretty proficient egg layer despite her age, or perhaps it's because of her experience. Regardless, she would often breed year after year without taking a break, alongside her best-known mate, Akiyakame. Akiyakame isn't her first mate, she's had at least one before him, but of course when you're the oldest known individual of your species to have ever lived, you're going to start outliving some of your husbands. Between 2006 and 2018, Wisdom and Akiyakame not only returned to the atoll to breed every single year, but during that period they also had a 100% success rate. Every year the egg they laid would hatch and the chick would survive until fledging. It seems Wisdom's name really is earned. She must have some wisdom in raising chicks to be so good at it. Actually, it's estimated that over the course of her life, Wisdom has probably laid up to 60 eggs and successfully raised over 40 chicks, which is pretty incredible. I think I already mentioned it, but the majority of albatrosses return to the same place that they were born to breed, so every year when Wisdom returns home, she's probably surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And probably like great-great-grandchildren and beyond, given that she's been laying eggs since at least the 50s. I mean, I feel like she's basically just the grandmother of her entire species by this point, symbolically if not quite literally. Although give it a few more generations and I'm sure eventually every laysan albatross on the planet will be descended from Wisdom in some way. Although albatrosses rarely return to land and so can't really be tracked for most of the year, or sometimes several years at a time if they're not in the mood for raising kids, but one thing that does help is that they will often return to the exact same nest site, which I suppose is to help them reunite with their mate, but it has the added benefit of also making it easier for the scientists to keep an eye on individuals. Like, obviously they're not glued to their nests 24/7, but it at least gives a frame of reference for the general area to look for if you want to find a specific wild bird, and I would imagine Wisdom is the individual who gets looked for more than any other, at least compared to the rest of her species. There isn't really much out there about Akiyakame, who for years was Wisdom's mate, but one thing I did find out in my research that I am genuinely in love with is that the word Akiyakame, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, literally translates to lover of wisdom in English. It's just adorable, it's so cute! I don't know why I love it so much, I just do. However, Wisdom's story isn't all cute and fun and happy. As I'm sure most of you remember, on the 11th of March 2011, there was a magnitude 9 earthquake off the east coast of Japan. It was the 4th most powerful earthquake ever recorded, and it triggered a massive tsunami which caused untold damage, claiming almost 20,000 lives and leaving thousands and thousands of survivors injured or having lost everything. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because the tsunamis also hit Midway Atoll, which at this time was full of seabirds and their chicks. The smallest of the atoll's 3 islands, Spit Island, was completely engulfed by the tsunami. The other 2 islands, Eastern Island and Sand Island, weren't quite so badly hit, although that's not to say that they got off lightly. They were still hit by the tsunami, with about 60% of Eastern Island ending up underwater. Sand Island was the least damaged, but it was still about 20% covered. And as you can imagine for a ground-nesting species with very little shelter, on these tiny flat stretches of land, the scale of damage was immense. But birds aren't the only ones to call the atoll home. There are people who live there too, all involved with the wildlife refuge either as staff or volunteers. Some people are only there temporarily as and when there's a need for them, while for others it's a much more long-term position, with people living on the islands in order to monitor the birds. And there are the most people there during the birds' nesting season, which is exactly the time that the tsunami hit. Thankfully though, despite the scale of destruction and damage, there wasn't a single human casualty on the atoll. Everyone got through okay, which is honestly kind of a miracle. I mean, I imagine they were shaken, it must have been terrifying, but everyone survived, and from what I can tell, I don't think anyone was even physically harmed, and that's what matters most. Unfortunately though, the avian residents of the atoll would not be so lucky. As soon as it was safe, staff at the refuge set out to help as many birds as they could, and they were able to save about 300 or so birds that were found severely waterlogged or otherwise entrapped. Which is a great feat, but of course there were still heavy losses, which were hard to estimate given the scale of the damage and the fact that it was hard to know if an adult bird wasn't there because they'd been washed away or because they were simply out at the sea feeding and were unharmed. The initial estimate was that about 1,000 adults had been killed, along with tens of thousands of chicks. However, it would eventually become clear that the death toll was far, far greater than that. To give you an idea of the scale of devastation left in the tsunami's wake, in early January, Spit Island had been home to just over 1,500 albatross nests, comprised primarily of laysan albatrosses, but also some black-footed ones too. Each one of those nests had an egg, and later a chick. After the tsunami, there were only 4 chicks who survived, and honestly, considering that the entire island was completely covered by the tsunami, the fact that there were any survivors is impressive. And although Spit Island was the most severely affected, it also had the lowest population to start with because at only 15 acres, it's only a fraction of the size of the other two islands. Eastern Island is 366 acres, and Sand Island just over 1100, which of course means that they were home to many more nests, and thus were the scene of many more casualties. Ultimately, it's believed that about 110,000 albatross chicks were killed across the atoll, which accounted for about 22% of all chicks born that year, as well as 2,000 adults. And when conservationists were taking stock of the atoll's losses, there was one question that everyone was desperate to know the answer to. What had happened to Wisdom? Had she survived, or had her long life finally been cut short by the tsunami? Well, for a while no one knew. There was no sign of Wisdom on the island, but as I said, that didn't necessarily mean she'd come to harm. She could have been out at sea foraging for food. The only way to find out if she was okay was to simply wait and see if she ever returned. I'm pleased to say, though, that Wisdom's chick survived. Once again, she seemed to live up to her name, having nested in a spot that was on higher ground and partially protected by a sand dune. Perhaps all her years of experience paid off and she chose that nesting spot because she knew it was safer, or perhaps it was just luck. Although even if the location of Wisdom's nest was just a fortunate coincidence, the fact that it was so well protected wasn't entirely. You see, conservationists had planted at least some of the sand dunes on the atoll, including the one near Wisdom's nest, with native plants specifically to help protect the islands and their inhabitants against rising sea levels, and clearly it worked. Had it not been for that, Wisdom's chick may not have fared so well. But this chick, who is known by his band N333 and is believed to be a male, was safe, for now. But without a mother to care for him, he wouldn't survive long. All he could do was sit and wait. For over a week there was no sign of Wisdom, and the conservationists waiting for her to return must have been beginning to lose hope. But then, on the 20th of March 2011, Wisdom would reappear, safe and well and with food for her son, who would go on to successfully fledge. And actually, I have an update on N333. As is typical, after fledging he disappeared for years, living out at sea full time until he was old enough to find a mate and start breeding. But he did return. In 2021 he was found setting up a nest with his mate and going on to raise what was believed to be his first ever chick, Wisdom's grandbaby. And if this chick really was N333's first chick, that would mean that he didn't start breeding until he was 10 years old, which really goes to show that Wisdom could have been older than 5 when she was first tagged. She could well be even older than we know. By all accounts, N333 and his family are doing well, and honestly, I am so happy for them. He could so easily have been one of the 100,000 plus chicks who never got to grow up because of the tsunami. So the fact that he did, and he's now raising his own chicks, it just makes me so happy. Unfortunately though, not every member of Wisdom's family was doing so well. I found conflicting sources on when Akiyakami, Wisdom's mate, was last recorded. An article from January this year, which is 2024 if you're listening to this in the future, said that he was last seen in winter 2021, that he and Wisdom raised a chick together as usual and then returned to the ocean as they always do. However, another article written in December 2022 states that he didn't return for the 2021 breeding season. Usually when I come across conflicting information, I tend to go with whichever source seems more reliable, but I can't do that in this case as both of those articles are from the US Fish and Wildlife Service website. I mean, I would tend to lean more towards the one that was written closer to the time as being more accurate, which would mean Akiyakami wasn't there for the 2021 breeding season, but either way, what we know for sure is that Akiyakami definitely didn't return for the 2022 breeding season, even though Wisdom did. He has never returned since, and it's assumed that that's because he's no longer alive. I don't think Akiyakami's age was known, but he and Wisdom had been together for a long time, so he was probably pretty old. It's believed that Wisdom had already outlived at least one mate before she found Akiyakami, and now here she was again, bird-widowed. I suppose at her age that's just to be expected. Although albatrosses spend large swaths of their time apart when they're living out at sea and only come together to mate, something they don't even tend to do every single year, they still bond incredibly closely with their partners. They mate for life and have a series of intricate and complex ritual dances that they perform to rekindle their bond every time they return to each other. And they're often a couple for years before they actually start breeding. And when one albatross passes away, their grieving mate will often go several years before they try and court anyone new. Wisdom is now at least 73 years old, and you might think at that age that she'd be happy to retire from breeding. That once she realised Akiyakami wasn't ever coming back, she might want to take a break rather than immediately trying to find herself a new mate. But that's not the case. This girl cannot be stopped, not by natural disasters and not by dead husbands. In December 2023, she was spotted engaging in courtship behaviours, trying to bag herself a new man. She's honestly just incredible. At the time of writing, the most recent sighting of Wisdom was in April of this year, only a couple of months ago, where she was once again trying to impress males with her courtship dance. There are photos of her hanging out with some other albatrosses, and honestly, she doesn't really look that much older than them. You really wouldn't guess that she's in her mid-70s. And I don't doubt for a second that Wisdom will succeed in finding a new mate and continuing to raise chicks. Like most animals, or actually like all animals except from humans and orcas, albatrosses don't go through the menopause. The females tend to keep breeding for as long as they're alive, and Wisdom, by all accounts, is going as strong as ever. Wisdom has single-handedly, or single-wingedly I should probably say, rewritten everything we thought we knew about her species. There was a time when laysan albatrosses were thought to only live to be about 40, and now she's well on her way to doubling that. The truth is that no one knows exactly how old laysan albatrosses can live now. Their lifespan is typically just described as being over 50, because we simply don't know the upper limit anymore. And the thing is, wisdom may not actually be all that unique. Not every single laysan albatross in the world is banded, not even everyone that visits Midway Atoll is banded. There are way too many to tag and monitor individually. And that means that potentially there are other albatrosses out there who are just as old as Wisdom and have simply managed to avoid being documented. There could be albatrosses out there who are even older than her. And hell, she could be even older than we think she is. No one knows when she was hatched. She's believed to be about 73, 74 years old now, but that's the absolute minimum she could be. Because of her age, Wisdom has become something of a celebrity by this point. For the last decade or so, there have been regular updates whenever she returns to Midway Atoll or lays an egg or fledges another chick. When I first added Wisdom's name to my list of episode ideas, the last reported sighting of her was that one in December 2023, but then by the time I got around to writing that script there was the new one from April, and even though I'm writing and recording this episode in mid-May, I've got quite a buffer of episodes built up, so this one isn't due to come out for over a month, and if there are any more updates on her by then I'll jump in with them here, but if not, then I'm planning on still keeping an eye on her, and if there are any exciting updates on her story, like if she does find a proper mate and lay another egg, then I'll include it in the tail end of an episode in my awkward little talky outro bit. Yeah, that's definitely the technical term for that. Or I might upload it as like a mini bonus episode on some random day in between regular uploads. I realised while I was writing this episode that I very, very rarely cover animals who are still alive. I guess because I cover a lot of historical cases, and unfortunately even when I do more recent ones, animals just don't tend to live as long as humans. The only other animal I've covered so far that's probably still alive is Tommaso the cat, and even then we don't know for sure because his caretaker is so secretive, which I obviously don't blame her for given the circumstances. You'll understand if you've listened to the episode, but because of that I don't think we're ever really going to be getting any Tommaso updates. Like, maybe once he passes away that might be mentioned somewhere, but I don't know. It's nice covering live animals though, because it means I don't have to end the episode on a sad note about their passing. I don't usually have a super rigid list of the order I do episodes in. I have like my big master list, which has every single animal, species, event and topic that I want to cover on this podcast, and it is quite literally hundreds of entries long. I'm never going to get to the end of it, which I guess is a good thing for the longevity of the show. And then I also have a much shorter list of the ones that I'm planning to cover soon. But whenever I start researching a new episode, I just kind of pick out whichever one seems most interesting at the time, and looking at that list now, yeah, there aren't many animals there that are still alive. I may have to try and rectify that a little. If you know any interesting stories of animals that are still alive, please let me know. Or if you know any good stories of animals that aren't alive, I'm always on the hunt for episode ideas. You know, because I don't already have enough in that terrifyingly long list I'm never going to get to the bottom of. And do you want to know what's really wild? Wisdom isn't even the oldest bird in the world. She's the oldest wild bird, but there's at least one bird in captivity that's older than her. Possibly two, although one isn't verified. And that one I'm also not 100% sure if it's still alive. There aren't many recent updates on it. But, you know, if you fancy another episode about a super old bird, then let me know, because I've already got two potentials lined up. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I feel slightly disoriented because I sort of slipped into my more casual, less scripted outro style without really realising it, so now I've got to, like, the actual outro. I feel slightly lost. Also, I haven't had a chance to listen to any of this back, so I don't know if you can tell, but I have really not been recording under the best of circumstances this week. So I'm really sorry if, like, the sound quality's not very good or something. I've done my best in a not great situation. Wow, aren't you glad you listened to my show? I'm such a skilled natural podcaster, you'd never guess that I'm not a professional or anything. Anyway. Thank you for listening this week. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you did and you'd like to support the show, then it would mean the world to me if you left us a positive review or rating, or shared it with a friend, or whatever else you can do that would help. I really, really do appreciate it. It makes a massive difference. Like, every single new download or listen or comment this podcast gets just brings me so much joy. It's honestly kind of pathetic, not gonna lie. Plus, you know the drill by now, if this podcast is ever able to earn money, then 100% of that is going to be donated to Animal Sanctuary the Little Rescue Zoo. So if you don't want to support the show for me and my weird parasocial emotional dependence on it, do it for the animals! The cute little rescue animals, how could you not? Subscribe to the show so you don't miss any future wisdom updates. New episodes come out every single Tuesday, and as I said, you don't have to worry about me running out of ideas anytime soon. I am quite literally drowning in them. So why not reach out and let me know what kind of thing you want to hear? Even if you don't have a specific topic to request, let me know what kind of stories you want to hear more of. Wild animals, domestic, historical, more modern, individual animals, entire species, rescues, conservation stories, sad, inspiring, cute, anything at all. Just reach out to me. Our email, website and social media will all be in the show notes if you want to have a chat, as will a list of sources used in this episode. And yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you once again for listening, and until next time, stay wild, friends.